Many thanks for inviting me to talk today. My name is Amos Folarin and I work at the Maudsley Biomedical Research Centre based at King's College London. Much of the focus of my work has been in the mobile health space, developing capabilities for remote monitoring using a wide range of digital technologies. Today I'm going to speak about one of the projects we started relatively early in the pandemic called Covid-Collab. There'll be two parts to this talk. The first will briefly look at the software we developed at King's, which will be used to collect the remote monitoring data. And the second will look at the Covid-Collab project, a citizen science study, which we set up to observe people as they became ill with coronavirus. There's a website for a little bit more about the radar-based platform, and there's a recent paper, a preprint on the Covid-Collab analysis, if you are interested. So, on to a brief background about Radarbase, the remote monitoring platform we built to collect our data. In 2015, we began a number of remote monitoring research studies in our group, and we found we needed a platform to collect data from mobile phones, sensors, wearable devices, and third-party APIs, but also to deliver questionnaires and potentially interventions. At the time, we had a few options available to us, but largely these were found to be somewhat unsatisfactory for the purposes of the project we were working on at the time. The principal requirement of the platform was to handle data which was with high volume, velocity, and variety, and to make this available to multiple types of data consumers. This would initially be for research datasets, but also to provide user feedback and clinical dashboards. Now, there are many challenges when engineering this type of scale-out infrastructure. However, we were very fortunate that our work coincided with a spin-out from LinkedIn called Confluent, whose work around the Apache Kafka project, which is a scalable event data store and stream processing platform, later formed the core aspect of Radarbase. So yes, Kafka will be a very important part of Radar if you end up playing around with it. So our main design goals when we set out to build Radarbase were the platform had to be open source. So we released Radarbase under the Apache 2 license, providing free tooling for the mobile health community. Then scalability was a big limitation in the alternative platforms we had available to us, as I said, when we were first starting out with the development of Radarbase. So scalability was a kind of a key concern for us. So Radarbase is designed with all of the components to be essentially all horizontally scalable, and this was because initially we intended to enroll quite large cohorts, but also eventually we had ideas that people might eventually sort of take Radarbase into the clinical domain, in which case the requirements there would also require very large cohorts to follow. Radarbase is also modular and extensible, so it being open source, a natural angle here is people may want to do different things than we might want to do with the platform. So it's essentially modular and extensible, so you can select the various components you want, but you can also customize them as you desire. And this ties in with the Apache 2 license, so you can essentially use Radarbase is readily usable if you wanted to take it into a commercial type of application. And finally, real time. So data collected, we were very, very keen to be able to use the data we collected with Radarbase in a real-time capacity. So data collected with Radarbase can be processed event by event, and this can be used to provide insight and intervention close to the time of occurrence. So yes, these are kind of, I guess, the four kind of pillars of the requirements we had when developing Radar Base. Radar Base is an interacting system of components broadly broken down into three main parts. Firstly is the passive monitoring. This refers to data collected in the background. Passive data comes in four main sources. These are the phone sensors collected via the passive app. These include things like the accelerometer, phone use, local Bluetooth, device counts, etc. Then next we have the passive app integrated wearable devices. These devices connect directly over Bluetooth to the passive app and allow us to collect data in a more direct way from the devices with a lower latency. Next we have data collected from vendor RESTful APIs or data portals. Examples here include devices like the Fitbit or Garmin. And lastly we have an IoT framework. These IT sensors are a diverse range of sensor types with typically static deployments. So these are broadly the categories of passive data that we can collect in Radar Base. The next major category is the active monitoring. This is the other major type of data, and here conscious effort is required by the participants in order to generate the data. These are collected through the active app and include things like questionnaires or a variety of digital tests or tasks like 2-minute walking tests or Romberg tests, a variety of these kinds of things. The active app is also highly configurable, so it's relatively easy to add new content to it. So new questionnaires, for example, are just configuration files that can easily be created to provide the new questionnaire functionality. The active app also is the primary means through which we deliver notifications and interventions through to the participants with. So there is scheduling and push notification functionality inbuilt into the backend infrastructure of Radar Base. So. And then finally, there are third-party integrations. So the kind of interfaces for connecting new apps to Radar Base backend infrastructure are available, and an example here will be the use of the math science app, which was used in the Covid-Collab study. So I'll talk a little bit more about the math science app later in the talk. So mostly for a lot of our analysis, we're using this active app data to provide some context or labeling to the passive streams of data. In this way, most of our analysis is using these sort of labels in a supervised fashion. And then finally, we have, as part of Radar Base, we have the back-end infrastructure. So this is actually the kind of main machinery of Radar Base, I would say. So this is a set of microservices that have been developed with Apache Kafka providing horizontal scalability at the heart of the platform. This includes things like the management portal, horizontally scalable data storage, real-time data analysis capacity, intervention and feedback, and finally visualizations. Another third-party component, which is sort of separate to Radar Base, but we hold an integration to it, is the electronic case register form software called RedCap. So quite often in RedCap, we'll use an integration that's with RedCap, so you can store your ECRF data or more sensitive data in RedCap and separate that from the actual management portal in Radar Base. So this is sort of quite a nice functionality. Means you have all of the kind of capabilities of RedCap, like emailed surveys and such, which can be used alongside Radar Base. So to date, Radar Base has been used to collect data from a wide range of diseases. Some examples include depression, epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, heart disease, COPD, inflammatory lung disease, etc. You can find more information about Radarbase on the project website. Now I'll move on to discuss the early results from the Covid-Collab study. So this study is presently ongoing, but this is the kind of first analysis we've recently carried out. So why do we want to do this? On to our motivation for Covid-Collab. When the pandemic started, we were already involved in several mobile health studies using Radarbase, and we naturally considered if the platform and the wearable data could be useful for studying COVID-19. Firstly, connecting to participants allows us to collect data continuously in a near real-time way. Doing this without having any physical contact would also be important due to the restrictions in place at the time. We reasoned that this type of data might, in principle, be useful for things like digital diagnosis. So collecting data in near real time also, in principle, offered the opportunity to do just-in-time diagnosis and potential intervention. So, in principle, the possibility for early or even pre-symptomatic intervention could exist. Next, data collected is relatively cheap and scalable. So, many of the devices are already in the market, and mobile networks are pretty well developed globally. So, there shouldn't really be too much barrier for implementation. We're also aware that there are a number of other studies looking at, surveying participants using questionnaires and other types of surveys. At the time, we didn't really have a very good idea of what all the symptoms for COVID were, or how specific these could be. So we considered that maybe having some kind of passive signal could also be potentially a more objective way of surveying the population. Then remote monitoring approaches could be complementary to other digital strategies like contact tracing. So maybe kind of implementing both those systems together could be relatively straightforward to engineer. And digital epidemiology carried out at scale, forecasting at the population level using anonymized data was another potential opportunity. So using even a sort of a sample of the population with these devices could act as sort of a kind of canaries, providing information about what's what's happening in the population at large. So I mean, an analogy of using this kind of anonymized data I like is the way mobile phone data, location data, is used for estimating road traffic density. And I think a sort of similar kind of thing could be, idea could be applied for the kind of epidemiology side. And then finally, donated data and data collection software would be, in of its own right, a very useful resource for the current and future pandemics. So having kind of the open source Radarbase and mass science apps and other kind of components we've made use of here, we're are free essentially for people to take advantage of. Okay, so the study aims are fairly simple. First aim was to quantify the prevalence and severity of the long-term symptoms across the data we collected. I should say this is particularly the study aims for this analysis. We have a number of other pieces of work in progress around things like forecasting or sort of identification of or classification of symptomatic phases. And then the second aim was to look at identifying risk factors for severity and duration of the persistent symptoms. So this is, I should say, a more specifically long COVID analysis which we will discuss here. So I should also mention a bit about the app we developed for the Covid-Collab study. This app was called Math Science, published in kind of both Android and iOS stores. So participants were enrolled through the Math Science app, and we didn't use the Radarbase equivalent, which was the active app, because of a couple of requirements. In first instance, we were collecting both passive and active streams through this app, but also secondly, the Radarbase's means for enrolling participants was slightly different to what we needed. So we actually built this app from scratch using Flutter, and the Math Science app served as the main participant user interface for the study, performing things like registration, consent, questionnaire delivery, and limited phone sensor data collection. And then the other sort of significant part of Math Science app was carrying out the authentication and authorization for the wearable data collection for Fitbit and Garmin devices. So one novelty as well of the Covid-Collab app was its sort of slightly interesting way in which we built the symptom questionnaire data collection. So the Covid-Collab app used a list builder for collecting an initial but incremental list of symptoms. So the starting point for the symptoms collection was an initial set of WHO symptoms. However, as it was unclear what the defined set of symptoms were, the list builder would allow participants to input free text symptoms when they selected the other category. This would then suggest, as they were typing from the list of existing symptoms, things that matched the text input. Then participants could either enter a new entry or select the kind of the suggested ones. The idea here was that we wanted just to have a little bit more characterization than just having an other category, and also we wanted ideally to look at how we might converge on a kind of consensus set of symptoms. Let's try and kind of maybe also look at kind of capturing the kind of long tail of the distribution. So participants were prompted by push notifications to complete regular surveys on COVID symptoms experienced, including mood, mental well-being, vaccination, and diagnosis status could be filled in ad hoc. Participants were able to share through the app retrospective and prospective wearable data through their Fitbit and Garmin accounts, though we only used the former in the study. The study is still ongoing, but for this analysis period, we cut the dataset at August 2022. We have approximately 17,000 participants enrolled at that point. A couple of months into the study, we formed a collaboration with Fitbit with the agreement to advertise the Covid-Collab study to UK Fitbit members via a special tab in the Fitbit app. We reasoned that this would be a good opportunity to access a large group of people with Fitbit devices who also had pre-COVID historic data available. The Radarbase platform would then be used for Fitbit data collection. Not knowing what levels of recruitment to expect, but knowing we would be able to access historic data post hoc, we decided to encourage participants to enroll in the study if they had yet to contract COVID and prospectively provide data. We then also requested that they join the study if they had previously contracted COVID and were wearing devices during the illness. In this way, retrospective wearable data could be collected. This was a valuable decision, as many participants would enroll in the study after they'd been infected with COVID and received the diagnosis. For the retrospective cohort, wearable data and recall of diagnosis were provided. However, they would not be able to provide symptom data up to the point of enrollment. It would be useful to also note that the COVID-19 infection seemingly provided a strong motivation to enroll in the study, with approximately half of the retrospective enrollment group onboarding only a few days, within only a few days of their diagnosis, implying that perhaps they had already some knowledge of the study, but had not opted to sign up until they were ill. For all participants where data was available, we collected wearable data covering the period prior to the pandemic, giving us a historic baseline against which to compare. Now, this would also prove useful for accounting for things like seasonal variation and regularizing our regression analyses. So the study metrics we collected fell into two main categories. Firstly, those were delivered from the in-app were app-delivered questionnaires. These were either provided at the enrollment time or ad hoc, so they could be completed any time during the participant wanted, or they were delivered in a sort of scheduled sort of periodic fashion, so over the course of the study. Questionnaires collected included the PHQ-8, GAD-7, and arousal and valence, then specific to symptoms relating to COVID-19 diagnosis and vaccination. We regularly prompted twice weekly for the completion of self-reported questionnaires on the current symptoms and diagnosis status, with participants also able to complete the arousal arousal and valence and symptoms questionnaires ad hoc at any time they chose to do so. PHQ-8 and GAD-7 were prompted for every 2 weeks. The diagnosis question could be filled out also any time by the participants. This also allowed for multiple infections to be recorded. Secondly, passive data were collected either via phone sensors or from Fitbit devices. So we collected both the data at the aggregation level of 1 day, so we had daily daily statistic summaries. So, but we also had the capacity to collect data, sort of collecting the intraday time series of data. So continuous passive data collected from wearable devices included the heart rate variability, sleep duration, sleep efficiency, step count, and activity log. And then the analysis discussed in this presentation specifically focuses on the daily summary, so those are these aggregated data. Though higher resolution intraday data was also collected, we haven't analysed that as part of this presentation. Phone sensor data was also collected, included things like location. However, that was only collected in the first part of the pandemic, as later on it became this data was not available to the app to collect, and had fallen under kind of a restricted category by Google. So on to the results for the study. At the time of this analysis, a cut of the data was taken in August of this year, so 2022, and we had 17,667 participants enrolled. We know in particular our cohort was weighted towards female participants, with some 76% identifying as female. Eligibility was also restricted to members over 18 years old. This combination of criteria and likely biases in the underlying availability of wearable devices mean it should not be considered a representative sample of the population. So due to the paucity of available testing early in the pandemic, we also initially considered a symptom-based diagnosis criteria. However, due to the increased testing availability over the course of the pandemic, we decided against including this in the analysis, only opting to use participant self-report of a positive medical test, either via PCR or antigen tests. A set of participants not reporting infection was also taken as age, sex, and time-matched controls. So the first of our analyses looks at a group-wide analysis, looking at the differences across disease progression between cases and controls. In this first analysis, we compare passive and self-reported metrics between case and time-match controls at post-infection and pre-infection periods. The basic scheme for this for the group analysis follows the categorization of COVID-19 by NICE guidelines on symptoms experienced. These are specified as acute COVID under 4 weeks post-infection, ongoing COVID between 4 and 6 weeks, and post-COVID being over 12 weeks of symptoms. We wanted to investigate the differences in parameters we collected over each of the periods between COVID-19 cases and match controls. This would give us a better idea of what was happening over the course of the illness. We also compared the group baselines between 4 to 8 weeks prior to diagnosis, with the assumption that these was a reasonable pre-infection reference. The analysis we conducted was a Brunner-Munzel test was carried out over each group for each metric, including resting heart rate variability, sleep duration, sleep efficiency, step count, PHQ-8 score, GAD score, arousal and valence at baseline, acute, ongoing, and post-COVID periods. The results for the Brunner-Munzel test show the differences between the remote monitoring data collected across each of the disease phases. It should be not shown here, but we note that there is no significant difference between case and control groups in any of the metrics in the period prior to diagnosis, so the 4 to 6 week baseline period. Resting heart rate is significantly elevated over each of the 3 post-infection phases. It's important to note that at the mean and significance for the resting heart rate is quite a bit lower than expected, and we'll come on to this in the next slide. Heart rate variability does not appear to be significantly changed across the 3 phases. Step count is significantly negatively affected during the acute period, but is not significantly changed in the ongoing or post-COVID phases. Steps recovering quickly compared to the resting heart rate confirms to some extent that there is a reasonable delineation between the acute and ongoing phases in people appearing at least superficially to have returned to a measure of their daily activity. Sleep efficiency is decreased in each of the 3 phases. However, sleep duration does not seem to be significantly changed across the 3 phases. And then next we looked at the emotional states, so the emotional valence gauges to the extent which an emotion is positive or negative, and the arousal references the intensity or the strength of the associated emotional state. The emotional state is negatively impacted with greater intensity in all phases, though most notably during the acute phase. For mental health measures, PHQ-8 and a measure of mood, and the GAD-7 questionnaire measure of anxiety, both show significant increases in the cases over each of the three phases. The dynamics of some of these metrics are plotted here. The shaded area corresponds to the 95% confidence interval taken over a 14-day window. For some metrics, there's perhaps a tentative indication that change begins before the diagnosis date. However, here shown as t equals 0, the vertical grey bar. While it's hard to be precise due to the inherent uncertainty in the diagnosis timing, we reason that it's likely just a measure of the latency in diagnostic testing than, say, the indication of a pre-symptomatic signal. For the most part, we can probably make the assumption that in most cases, tests were performed for symptomatic reasons. We did, however, request in the diagnosis questionnaire that participants also log the first date they recall feeling ill. And we will, in a further analysis, look at this more carefully and inspect the timings of the signal of recall of illness with the changes in the measures we've collected. We also note that there is something interesting going on with heart rate. So the resting heart rate seems to go up after infection, and then within about 14 days falls back down again, and then subsequently rises again within peaking about 28 days again after this. We see here that there is a non-monotonic change in resting heart rate during the acute phase between 0 and 28 days, with inflection points shortly after diagnosis date and again approximately 14 days post-infection. We mentioned previously that the significance of the change in the acute phase resting heart rate is somewhat less than expected, and this is because the window of the acute phase overlaps both the peaks and troughs here, and therefore averages out. So these changes are substantially less significant than the statistical tests in the previous group analysis. There is, however, there's perhaps some argument that perhaps the acute phase might be better considered as two distinct subphases, though there appears some evidence for relative bradycardia, and precise factors driving this are not entirely understood. Further evidence for the non-monotonic changes in resting heart rate are shown in at least 2 other studies collecting wearable data during the COVID-19. We note the same pattern and time frame for the peaks and troughs match quite well with the Covid-Collab results here. There's also unpublished data using other devices, including a Garmin and Apple Watches, that also demonstrate this effect. For steps, we see this falls precipitously near diagnosis, as resting is prioritized by participants shortly after diagnosis. We note that steps return fairly quickly to normal baseline levels. This happens well before resting heart rate is recovered to baseline levels. This recovery in steps aligns with the second rise in resting heart rate. And one interpretation of this is participants have recuperated from the worst effects of COVID-19 within approximately 14 days, although physiologically the resting heart rate indicates that they are not in fact fully recovered. It is tempting to consider that there is some potential interaction between the step measurements and resting heart rate, given the extent of the anticorrelation in this acute phase. The hypothesis for this sequence starts with increased symptoms such as fever leading to initial rise in resting heart rate. Increased rest then follows, and this somehow leads to the drop in relative resting heart rate. And conversely, the increase in exercise following steps, a recovery of steps, is responsible for the secondary rise in resting heart rate. However, a problem with this is it is somewhat odds with the definition of resting heart rate we have, which, as defined by the device vendor, is as a measurement of resting heart rate during sedentary levels of activity and during sleep. It is possible, however, that some bleed through of exercise may be in effect, and resting heart rate would therefore not be as clean a measure as expected. Although this is something of conjecture at present, and we have not data to investigate this. Another possible explanation is due to the observation of relative bradycardia reported in some COVID-19 patients in the literature, among other etiologies including arrhythmias and cardiomyopathies. When Covid-Collab started in 2020, we had very little information available on long COVID. While there is more information available now, it's still very much defined as a syndromic condition. We therefore determined to look at 2 different ways to establish risk factors related to continued symptoms based on the data we had available. The first method looks at a sustained change in resting heart rate as measured with Fitbit devices. And the second method uses persistent self-reported symptoms taken from the symptoms questionnaire. The first method we've termed risk factors for resting heart rate defined long COVID. In this analysis, we used change in resting heart rate over a period of 12 weeks post COVID-19 diagnosis as a proxy for long COVID. Here, in resting heart rate at 12 weeks post COVID infection is the outcome variable for this model. So, the first method we've termed risk factors for resting heart rate defined long COVID. In this analysis, we use change in resting heart rate over a period of 12 weeks post COVID-19 diagnosis as a proxy for long COVID. Here, resting heart rate at 12 weeks post-infection is the outcome variable. To estimate the expected baseline heart rate if a participant did not have COVID, we use the Bayesian structural time series model on each participant's resting heart rate up until the date of diagnosis. This model comprised a local level model, a seasonal model with a period of 28 days, and a regularized regression on a set of 500 participants who were not otherwise involved in the analysis. In total, 597 COVID-positive participants had passive data available across the whole time period and were considered for this analysis. The historic activity and sleep duration taken from Fitbit data between 6 months and 2 years before diagnosis. The historic activity is the average duration of time in minutes spent in the Fitbit high activity level per day, and the sleep duration is the average time spent asleep per day. The change in resting heart rate between baseline and acute phase is defined as the difference between the average resting heart rate 1 to 4 weeks prior to diagnosis and 0 to 4 weeks after COVID-19 diagnosis. To estimate the risk factors, the change in resting heart rate at 12 weeks is used as the outcome variable in a linear regression with age 6, historic activity, historic sleep duration, and the change in resting heart rate between the baseline and acute phase. The results for the resting heart rate defined long COVID are shown here. We see age, decreased historic activity, and acute phase change in resting heart rate are all significant risk factors for increased resting heart rate at the 12-week post-diagnosis period. Sleep does not appear to influence this, nor does sex. However, we note that in other publications there is some evidence of increased risk for female sex in long COVID, but by the resting heart rate definition and the data we have here, we didn't observe this. The COVID-19 symptom questionnaire was used to collect self-report on types and severity of symptoms experienced. A heat map shows the frequency and on the color scale and duration of these symptoms, and the severity at three levels collected. So these included mild, moderate, and severe in the rows, the horizontal rows. As expected, we can see severe symptoms are mainly reported during the acute phase, but moderate and mild symptoms are commonly persistent. Especially so for fatigue, anosmia, headache, muscle pain, cough, and breathing problems. We can also see that certain symptoms such as cough and breathing problems and fatigue also show higher background levels. In the second approach, we investigate how symptoms could be used to define long COVID. Here we consider participants who have self-reported symptoms for an extended period following a self-reported diagnosis of COVID-19. The self-reported symptoms submitted by all participants who reported a positive diagnosis were used to determine the length of illness and split the diagnosed cohort into short and long COVID groups. If at least one symptom was reported at least once per week for at least 12 weeks, the participant was assigned to the symptom-based long COVID group. Participants were otherwise assigned to the symptom-based short COVID group. Inclusion criteria for continuous variables was based on a completion rate of at least 60% in baseline and acute phases. After exclusion of participants with missing data and required variables, 1,327 participants with a positive diagnosis of COVID were used for the analysis. These comprised 1,104, or 83% of the in the short COVID group, and 161, or 12%, in the long COVID group. Risk factors were assessed using logistic regression on the two groups based on demographics, passive data, and mental health scores during the passive and acute phase of COVID infection. The results from the multiple logistic regression series are shown here. Each regression was on a single explanatory variable and adjusted for age, gender, and ethnicity. The p-values were adjusted using the Benjamini-Hochberg correction for multiple testing. As we can see here, the acute phase resting heart rate and historic activity, while significant in the previous resting heart rate defined long COVID analysis, not found to be significant here after correction at the 0.5 threshold. However, age, PHQ-8, and GAD scores do show significance. It's interesting to note that, as we've shown earlier, participants recover quickly to baseline steps based on the passive data around the end of the acute phase, suggesting that the elevated resting heart rate is not something perhaps noticeable to the participants, or at least it is not preventative of a return to baseline levels of step activity, and is therefore possible that symptoms which are noticeable by the participants are selective of a different set of people. And therefore the agreement between resting heart rate and symptom-defined long COVID is probably not fully overlapping. However, more research is required to understand implications of elevated resting heart rate would also be useful. In conclusion, using the radar-based platform and the Mass Science app and donated wearable data, we demonstrate measurable differences in mental health, well-being, and biosignals from commercial wearable devices between COVID positive and non-diagnosed control participants during the 16-week period following diagnosis. This evidence suggests that wearable devices could be useful as part of the toolkit for automated detection and monitoring of COVID-19 and potentially other respiratory diseases. The non-monotonic changes observed in resting heart rate observed during the acute phase is of interest, though at present we do not have a clear understanding of the causes of this. We're presently analysing the intraday time series data to study the factors involved here at a much higher temporal resolution. Persistent symptoms and long COVID are important to understand. Two methods for inferring the presence of long COVID are compared in this study. First, we observed an objective signal of persistent change in resting heart rate as measured as a measure of long COVID. In the second approach, we looked at a more subjective method of sustained symptom reporting as a measure of long COVID. We evaluated the risk factors associated with these two methods of defining long COVID with some agreement, but also we observed some differences. In the future, we plan to assess the feasibility of combining studies to create larger data sets and perhaps perform some meta-analyses across these to develop work around COVID and long COVID detection and forecasting. This work obviously involved several people, so it's with many thanks to the mobile health team of my group, whose sort of combined effort was involved in the production of this project and analysis. And also many thanks to the sponsors and contributors to the radar-based platform.